Hawk?
If I open my eyes and you're not a blonde pushover, you're in trouble.
Here's something that should stop you cold. The Korean War lasted 3 years. MASH ran for 11. The characters in that show spent almost 4 times longer in a fictional version of the war than the real soldiers spent in the actual one. Let that sink in for a second. A television series set during a 3-year military conflict somehow outlasted the conflict by nearly a decade, and not just survived, but dominated. It became one of the most watched shows in the history of American television. Its finale was seen by more than 125 million people. In a country of roughly 230 million. That's more than half the nation sitting down for a single television episode. But the real story of MASH isn't the ratings. It's everything that happened inside the production. The fights with the network, the death that stunned a nation, the wildfire that destroyed the set, the laugh track nobody wanted, the cast member hiding a medical condition for 7 seasons, the writer recruited from London because Hollywood had broken him. 15 facts today. And I'd argue the one we close on is the reason this show still matters. Not as a piece of nostalgia, but as a genuine statement about what television can dare to be. Let's count it down. 15. The $500 deal that started everything.
In there was not only unbecoming an officer, it was...
The show that would eventually earn hundreds of millions of dollars in syndication rights started with one of the most undervalued sales in Hollywood history. Richard Hooker? A pen name for H. Richard Hornberger, a real Army surgeon who served with the 8055th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital during the Korean War, spent 12 years writing his novel, MASH, a novel about 3 Army doctors. Then he spent 5 more years trying to find a publisher. When he finally sold it, the novel was adapted into a 1970 Robert Altman film. And when the television rights were eventually sold for the series, Hornberger received $500 per episode. Not a percentage, not back-end points, not a sliding scale tied to ratings. $500 per episode for the rights to the story that would become one of the longest-running and most financially successful series in CBS history. Even adjusting for inflation, it remains one of the most lopsided deals in entertainment history. Hornberger had based the character of Hawkeye Pierce on his own experiences, his own skill as a surgeon, his own dark humor as a coping mechanism, his own ambivalence about the war he'd been sent to fight. He had put the most formative years of his life into that book, and the resulting television series ran for 11 seasons, won 14 Emmy Awards, and generated syndication money that dwarfs any reasonable estimate of what $500 per episode adds up to. The man who lived the story got the least of what the story earned. That's not an unusual story in Hollywood, but it's rarely been quite so stark. 14. The writer who had to be rescued from London. When CBS decided to develop a television series based on the MASH film, they needed a writer who could translate Robert Altman's subversive, darkly comic sensibility into something that could survive weekly network broadcast. The name they landed on was Larry Gelbart, a comedy writer with exceptional credentials, having worked on Sid Caesar's Your Show of Shows alongside talents like Mel Brooks and Neil Simon. There was one complication. Gelbart had left Hollywood. He was living in London, having become deeply disillusioned with the American television industry, burned out by the compromises, the interference, the grinding machinery of network production. He had gone abroad specifically to get away from all of it. CBS tracked him down and made their pitch. Gelbart was initially resistant. He didn't want to come back. He didn't particularly want to spend his creative energy on a television adaptation of a military comedy. But the concept, a show set in Korea that was really about Vietnam, using the cover of a past war to say things about a present one that network television couldn't say directly, was interesting enough that he eventually agreed. He came back from London, developed the pilot, and became the creative engine of the show's first 5 seasons. The best creative decision CBS made in the development of MASH wasn't a casting choice or a format decision. It was persuading a burned-out writer in a London apartment that there was still something worth making. 13. The laugh track nobody wanted. This is one of the great creative battles in American television history, and the side with more power won, at least at the beginning. Nobody involved in MASH wanted a laugh track. Not the writers, not the producers, not the cast. The argument against it was simple and difficult to refute. This is a show set in a war. People are dying in the operating room. The authentic response to that environment is not a recording of studio laughter piped in whenever someone delivers a punchline. CBS disagreed. Network executives were concerned that without canned laughter, audiences wouldn't understand the show was a comedy. They worried the tone was too dark, too ambiguous, too likely to leave viewers confused about how they were supposed to feel. The laugh track went in, over the producers' objections. What followed was a years-long negotiation. The producers argued successfully that the operating room scenes, where the stakes were most serious and the tone most clearly dramatic, should be exempt from the laugh track. CBS agreed to that compromise. So the operating room became a laugh track-free zone from relatively early in the run, even as the rest of the show retained the canned laughter. By the later seasons, the laugh track grew quieter and less intrusive. The BBC, which broadcast the show in the United Kingdom, aired it entirely without the laugh track from the beginning, and most British viewers would be surprised to learn it ever had one. The producer's view was eventually vindicated. The show's finale, Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen, was broadcast without any laugh track at all. The network agreed that what was happening in that final episode was simply too serious, too real, too emotionally significant for canned laughter. It only took 11 years and a series finale to settle the argument. 12. The cast member who actually served in Korea.
Now that's tasteful without being gaudy.
Here's a detail that reframes the entire experience of watching MASH, particularly in the earlier seasons. Several cast members had military backgrounds. Alda served in the Army Reserve. Wayne Rogers had been a Navy navigator. Mike Farrell had been in the Marine Corps. Jamie Farr worked with the American Forces Network. But only one cast member had a personal connection to Korea that went beyond military service in general. Jamie Farr, who played Maxwell Klinger, the cross-dressing corporal perpetually attempting to get a Section 8 psychiatric discharge, was actually born and raised in Toledo, Ohio, the city Klinger is famously obsessed with throughout the run of the series. The character's relentless, passionate, almost irrational love for Toledo was not invented by the writers. It was Jamie Farr's actual relationship with his hometown, folded directly into the character. But more significantly, Farr worked with the American Forces Network, the military broadcasting service, during the Korean era. While the conflict had concluded, his connection to the military world that MASH depicted was more real than almost anyone else on the cast. There's something quietly powerful about the fact that the character who most desperately wanted to go home, who constructed elaborate schemes, wore women's clothing, staged fake breakdowns, all to escape the war, was played by the cast member with the most genuine, personal connection to what it meant to serve far from Toledo. Klinger's longing for home was, in a specific way, real. 11. Alda got the role 6 hours before filming. The most iconic character in the show's history, Captain Benjamin Franklin Hawkeye Pierce, the irreverent, morally serious, perpetually sardonic heart of MASH, was not confirmed for his role until roughly 6 hours before cameras began rolling. Alda was not the first choice. He was not extensively developed through a lengthy audition process. The production team was specifically looking for someone flamboyant and emotionally expressive, not the stoic action hero archetype that dominated military television at the time, but someone who could carry both the comedy and the genuine anguish of the character simultaneously. According to multiple accounts, Alda was confirmed so close to the start of production that there was essentially no time to prepare him in any formal sense. He was, by the show's own standards, thrown directly into the work. What he brought to Hawkeye was something the character required but couldn't be. Scripted, a genuine belief in the anti-war sentiment underneath the comedy. Alda later said the character had roots in the burlesque performance world he'd grown up around, a tradition of performance that was simultaneously comedic and emotionally raw, that didn't distinguish clearly between making an audience laugh and making them feel something true. That combination, comedy as a vehicle for genuine feeling rather than an alternative to it, is what made Hawkeye work, and it was cast 6 hours before filming started by a man who hadn't been anyone's obvious first choice. 10. Malibu was Korea, until it burned. The exterior scenes of MASH, the tented camp, the scrubby Korean hillsides, the helicopters arriving with the wounded, were filmed not in Korea, not on a studio lot designed to look like Korea, but in the Santa Monica Mountains near Malibu, California. Specifically, the production used a location at what is now Malibu Creek State Park. The terrain, with its dry brown hill and rugged geography, was judged to be a reasonable visual stand-in for the Korean landscape that viewers would have seen in documentary footage and news photography. For 11 seasons, that stretch of California hillside served as the permanent exterior of the 4077th MASH. And then, on October 9, 1982, with the show in its final weeks of production before the series finale, a brush fire swept through the area and destroyed most of the outdoor sets. The production didn't scramble for a replacement location or attempt to rebuild. Instead, they did something far more elegant. They wrote the fire directly into the finale. In Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen, the 4077th camp is destroyed by enemy bombing, which forces the unit to relocate, which gives the characters a reason to scatter, which provides the structural frame for the final goodbyes. The real-life disaster became the dramatic catalyst for the ending. Today, Malibu Creek State Park has preserved several of the remaining MASH set structures as a point of historical interest. Hikers occasionally stumble across the rusted remnants of a Jeep or the concrete foundations of what was once the 4077th. The show ran for 11 years in the mountains above Malibu. The fire that ended it also gave the finale its best scene. If you're enjoying this, the real story behind one of television's greatest achievements, subscribe. We cover the shows, the history, and the moments that defined American culture, week by week. 9. The Secret the Cast Didn't Know. March 18, 1975. The third season finale of MASH, an episode titled Abyssinia Henry, old-timey slang for I'll Be Seeing You. The episode in which Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, beloved commanding officer of the 4077th, receives his discharge orders and prepares to go home. What followed is still one of the most discussed creative decisions in American television history. McLean Stevenson had decided to leave the show at the end of the third season. The producers, Gene Reynolds and Larry Gelbart, wanted to make a statement about war. Their reasoning was simple and devastating. We want to remind the audience that people like Henry Blake actually die in wars. They don't all get to go home. With the Vietnam War still very much present in American consciousness, they felt the show had an obligation to say so. So they wrote Blake's death into the finale. And they kept the final scene. The scene in which Radar enters the operating room and announces that Henry's plane has been shot down over the Sea of Japan with no survivors, a secret from almost the entire cast. The script was distributed without its final page. The other scenes were filmed. And then, just before the final scene was due to be shot, the actors received the last page of the script and understood what was about to happen. The reactions on screen are not performance. They are genuine shock. Gary Burghoff, delivering the line as Radar, was working through real grief in the moment. The cast standing in the operating room, hands still occupied with instruments, in the middle of a scene, absorbs the news without preparation. The immediacy of it is documentary. McLean Stevenson was still on set when it was filmed. He hadn't been told either. He watched his character die. He left almost immediately. The season-ending cast party was canceled. The mood was simply too dark. The network received hundreds of angry letters from viewers who believed the show had violated some implicit agreement. It was, after all, a comedy. The producers wrote individual responses until the volume became unmanageable. Then they approved a form letter. It was the first time in American television history that a major character leaving a comedy series had been killed off in a tragic way. Every similar moment in 50 years of television since. Every time a departing character is given a meaningful rather than a convenient exit, traces its lineage back to that operating room in 1975. 8. Trapper John quit without saying goodbye. The departure of Henry Blake was dramatic, documented, and grieved publicly. The departure of Trapper John, Hawkeye's best friend, drinking partner, and partner in chaos, happened completely differently. Wayne Rogers, who played Trapper John McIntyre for the first 3 seasons, had been promised from the beginning that his character would be co-lead alongside Hawkeye. As the seasons progressed, the show's focus increasingly centered on Alda's Hawkeye, and Trapper's role diminished accordingly. Rogers became dissatisfied. The dynamic wasn't what he'd signed up for. During the summer break between the 3rd and 4th seasons, Rogers simply quit. He didn't negotiate a dramatic exit. He didn't work with the writers to craft a send-off. He was gone before the 4th season began filming. There was a complication. Rogers had never actually signed his contract. When 20th Century Fox sued him for breach of contract, the lawsuit collapsed because there was nothing legally to breach. He had spent 3 seasons playing one of the show's 2 lead characters on a handshake arrangement. The result, for viewers who returned in September 1975, was disorienting. Hawkeye went to meet Trapper's plane home, and Trapper had already left. No goodbye, no final scene, just a note and a shaving kit. The absence of closure became, in a quiet way, part of the show's emotional texture. Hawkeye never quite recovered from not getting to say goodbye to his best friend. That unresolved grief, running through the later seasons, was itself an accidental piece of honesty about war. People leave without warning. You don't always get closure. Rogers was later offered the lead role in CBS's spin-off Trapper John, MD. He declined, not wanting to be typecast in medical roles. Pernell Roberts of Bonanza took the role instead, and the character who had walked out the door without a word became, in syndication, a different actor's franchise. 7. The only actor in both the film and the show. Of all the actors who appeared in Robert Altman's 1970 MASH film, a cast that included Donald Sutherland, Elliot Gould, Tom Skerritt, and Robert Duvall, exactly one made the transition to the television series as a regular cast member: Gary Burghoff, Corporal Walter Radar O'Reilly. Burghoff had originated the role of Charlie Brown in the 1967 off-Broadway musical You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, a fact that somehow encapsulates the exact sweet, earnest quality he brought to Radar. He was in his late 20s for most of the series run, playing a character who was supposed to be 18. He had brachydactyly affecting 3 fingers on his left hand, a condition he generally kept out of camera view, though attentive viewers occasionally noticed the slight difference in his hands. It was never referenced, never explained. His performance as Radar was by most accounts the most consistently true thing in the entire ensemble. Mike Farrell, who worked alongside him for years, later said that Burghoff may well have been the best actor in the company. Gelbart and the writing staff created the character's famous ability to anticipate announcements. Radar would hear the helicopters before anyone else, would know what was coming before it arrived, as a kind of magical realism threaded through an otherwise grounded show. He left after the 7th season, burned out, wanting his family back. In his own account, he knew it was time when he was relaxing in his swimming pool at home and heard a plane overhead, and froze. His body had internalized the reflex. He was reacting like Radar. That was enough. What Burghoff left behind: 7 seasons, 1 Emmy, the indelible image of a boy reading his mail in a bunker, remains the emotional heart of what the show was in its best years. 6. The fire that gave the finale its best scene. The creative response to a genuine disaster reveals something specific about how the MASH production thought. When the brush fire destroyed the outdoor set in October 1982, the show had 1 episode left to film, the 2.5-hour finale that would close out 11 years and say goodbye to characters millions had been watching for over a decade. The sets were gone. The physical landscape of the 4077th no longer existed. Rather than reconstruct it or find a replacement location, the writers asked a single question: how do we use this? The answer was the bombing sequence. In the finale, the camp is destroyed by enemy fire, which forces the 4077th to relocate, which scatters the characters, which creates a final disorientation that mirrors the emotional state of every viewer watching. The characters lose their home at exactly the moment the audience loses the show. The physical destruction of the set and the narrative destruction of the camp happened simultaneously, by accident, and the production made them mean the same thing. Alan Alda wrote and directed the finale himself. The accidental fire had handed them something they couldn't have planned, a real ending that came from outside the story. When the disaster happens, the question isn't how to fix it, it's how to use it. 5. The episode filmed in real time. By the middle of the show's run, the writers were actively searching for formats that network television hadn't tried, not as novelty exercises, but as genuine attempts to say things the standard sitcom structure couldn't say. One of the most radical results was the Season 4 episode, Lifetime, an episode filmed to depict, in real time, the treatment of a soldier who has 20 minutes before paralysis becomes permanent. A clock ran in the corner of the screen throughout the episode. The surgery had to succeed within 20 minutes of screen time, or the patient would be paralyzed for life. No commercial breaks were written into the dramatic structure. The tension was the clock. The clock was real. It was genuinely experimental for 1975 network television. The kind of formal innovation you'd expect from prestige cable drama, delivered in the middle of a show that CBS had once worried audiences would mistake for a drama if they removed the laugh track. Another episode, Point of View, told its entire story from the perspective of a wounded soldier, the camera never leaving the soldier's point of view from the moment he was wounded on the battlefield through his evacuation, surgery, and recovery. No named character anchored the episode in the usual way. The viewer was the patient. These weren't stunts. They were the production team using the trust they'd built with an audience over years of conventional storytelling to take genuine creative risks. To ask the question, what if the format itself could be part of what we're saying about war? That willingness to experiment, to treat the audience as sophisticated enough to follow wherever the story led, is part of why MASH remains in a different category from most of what surrounded it. 4. Real veterans wrote the show. The writing staff of MASH made a decision early in the run that distinguished them from virtually every other series of their era. They went to the source. Not just historical records, not just books about the Korean War. They actively sought out veterans, surgeons, and nurses who had direct experience with MASH units and used their accounts as raw material for episodes. Specific medical situations, specific psychological responses, specific moments of absurdity and horror that had actually occurred in the field. The practice became so thorough that by the later seasons, the writers had to start turning veterans away. Not because the stories weren't good, but because they'd already covered them. What this gave the show was something research alone can never provide. A moral weight, rooted in real experience. When the humor failed, and something true was said about what war costs, that truth was usually sourced from someone who had actually been there. 3. McLean Stevenson thought he was the star. Henry Blake is one of the most beloved characters in the show's history. Warm, bumbling, genuinely decent, occasionally exasperating. The kind of commanding officer you'd want in a war zone because he left you alone to do your job. McLean Stevenson played him beautifully for 3 seasons, and then he left, and the decision has followed his legacy ever since. Stevenson was convinced that he, not Alan Alda, was the breakout star of MASH. He wanted his own show. CBS, anxious to keep him, had reportedly promised him various development deals. He left at the end of season 3, certain that his name and face would carry a new series as they had carried the 4077th. What followed was one of the most instructive cautionary tales in television history. Stevenson went on to headline a series of shows, The McLean Stevenson Show, Hello Larry, In the Beginning, and Condo, among others. And every single one failed. The critics were unkind. The ratings were worse. None lasted more than a season and a half. Later in his life, Stevenson gave an interview in which he said, with remarkable honesty, "I should have never left MASH. I thought they were enamored with McLean Stevenson, but they were enamored with Henry Blake." That distinction, between the performer and the character, between personal fame and the specific chemistry of a specific ensemble, is something Hollywood still hasn't fully learned. Stevenson understood it too late. He died of a heart attack in 1996 at 68, having never recaptured what he walked away from. 2 days after Stevenson died, Roger Bowen, who had played Henry Blake in the original 1970 film, also died of a heart attack. His family delayed announcing the news for a week, so that his obituary wouldn't be mistaken for a confused retelling of Stevenson's. 2 Henry Blakes, 2 weeks. The timing was so surreal that the show would have been criticized for implausibility if it had tried to write it. 2. The finale that rewrote television history. February 28, 1983. A Monday night. 125 million Americans sat down to watch a 2.5-hour television event called Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen. Let's put that in context. The Super Bowl that year drew 47 million viewers. The Seinfeld finale drew 76 million. The Game of Thrones finale drew fewer than 20 million. The MASH finale remains the single most watched scripted broadcast in American history. Of the 30 most watched television events ever recorded in the United States, it is the only one that isn't a Super Bowl. The finale had no laugh track. Alda wrote and directed it himself. It opens with Hawkeye in a psychiatric ward, broken down, and the reason, revealed slowly, is devastating. On a bus hiding from an enemy patrol, a woman had been asked to silence her chicken. The chicken wasn't a chicken. Hawkeye had buried the memory so completely he genuinely believed it was. That scene came from a real veteran's account. Alda wanted the finale to be honest about what the show had always been underneath the pranks and the martinis. A story about what war does to the people it doesn't kill. 125 million people watched it happen. 1. What the show was actually about. And here is the thing that most facts lists about MASH never quite reach. The show premiered in September 1972. The Vietnam War was still being fought. American soldiers were still dying. And CBS had a weekly comedy that was openly questioning whether any war was worth what it cost the people asked to fight it. It did this undercover, set in Korea. Technically a comedy, with a laugh track, at least in the early seasons. But anyone watching in 1972 or 1973 understood that Hawkeye's rage wasn't about Korea. It was about the war that was still happening. The show couldn't say this directly, so it said its slant, through a fictional past war, through doctors who couldn't stop the bleeding but kept trying, through a laugh track that felt wrong in the operating room, through Henry Blake's plane going down with no survivors. That's what MASH actually was, a show about the Korean War that was really about every war, a comedy about what it costs to keep laughing when everything around you is wrong. That's why it lasted 11 years. That's why 125 million people sat down for the finale. It was true, all the way down, and the audience knew. 15 facts. One show. And a question I want to put to you directly. Do you think MASH could be made today, the same way, with the same willingness to say hard things inside the frame of a comedy? Or has television become too segmented, too algorithm-driven, too certain of its audience to take that kind of risk? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you land. And if this is the kind of deep dive you've been looking for, subscribe. We'll be back next week.